very glad and honored to be here today to introduce Professor Olga Lomová from the Czech Republic. I recall the first time we know each other, it is about some 20 years ago, correct? Okay, at the time when I received a letter from Professor Lomová, at that time, of course, there are no emails, right? The letter asked me questions about my just published book on the receptions of Tang poetry. And this is the very first time for me to learn of a young scholar in Prague, in Central Europe, who are interested in Chinese literature. And it leads me to the awareness of the Sinology in Prague. And I learned that there is a very important tradition which can be termed as the Prague School. And Professor Lomová is certainly a representative of this very important tradition. And Professor Lomová is now the director of CCK Foundation. There's a 蔣经国基金 CCK Foundation International Sinological Center, and deputy directors of the Institute of East Asian Studies at the Chiang University in Prague. And I must say, on top of that, Professor Lomová is also the honorable advisor of the Research Center of Chinese Literature and Literary Culture of our institute. Okay. So, as an expert in the histories of Chinese literature, Professor Lomová has published many important articles on Chinese literature and translations from and into Chinese. And it is our privilege to have Professor Lomová to speak on the reception of Tang poetry in the area of Bohemia. Without further ado, let us welcome Professor Lomová.
大家好，陈教授刚才介绍我有一点有不敢当的感觉。我觉得我一辈子是学习的人，虽然我现在的任务是教学生，我还是有一种自己当学生的感觉。我来这之前，我们商量我用什么语言要演讲。也有一种建议，我用中文演讲，可是我不敢了，我还是用英语讲了。可是，假如你们有任何问题，你们就停止我。假如你们听不懂的话，那就停止我，我们来商量一下。我要用英文讲，而且在这儿会写我讲的最主要的词汇，还有一些比较简单的句子，让英文能力还不太强的学生都能听得懂我说的是什么。那我讲完以后要讨论，我希望你们大家都会多提问题，因为可能我讲的你们觉得意思是有意思，可是我还是要知道那个或者这个，所以我讲完以后你们提问题。假如要用中文提问题，欢迎。假如我听不懂的话，有同学们会帮助我翻译一下。好，那我讲这个主题，可能你们觉得有一点奇怪，我希望讲完以后你们会明白我为什么讲这么比较特别的或者奇怪的主题。好。So, actually, the topic I selected is closely related to my professional interests, but also to the very beginning of my personal interest in Chinese studies. And it is a question that is very often asked to me, why did you decide to study Chinese? And I say, because I thought I would like to read Chinese poetry in the original. And the Chinese friends tell me, what's so special about Chinese poetry? Why Chinese poetry? And I didn't think about it for a long time, but after I started to be in regular contact with Chinese colleagues and I learned more about Chinese history and culture, I realized that this is a very interesting issue, which has more general implications about how Europe and the West understands Chinese culture. And it can be even or understood in the past, because now I'm quite an old person and I have to say that my students' interest is sometimes very different from my own interest when I was a student. But I hope that you will see from my talk, or you try to follow one question in my talk, and it is how we perceive each other, how cultures communicate, and what makes us be interested in each other, what brings us together, what misconceptions we have about each other and ourselves, and how, after all, intercultural communication works, and many questions can be asked on basis of that. Okay, so Chinese poetry. Chinese poetry is something every Czech knows. What is Chinese poetry? I mean Chinese poetry. I remember many years ago when I was a young teacher, very enthusiastic about my new knowledge. There was a book published of so-called translations of Chinese poetry, and the translations were far away from the original. And I was asked to write a review. I wrote a review and I said, okay, these are very nice poems, but they are far away from what Tang poetry looked like. And I explained the historical context, the literary conventions, and I wrote a long article explaining that Tang poetry looked totally different from what the translator has brought to us. I didn't criticize him. I praised him for beautiful poetry, but I said this is different from what Tang poets were writing. And it rose great polemics. Every single newspapers in Czech Republic published an attack on me, saying she doesn't understand anything. And we all know what Chinese poetry looks like, and she doesn't understand anything. The people who wrote the critical reviews on my article never studied Chinese, but they knew what Chinese poetry looks like. And one of the review ended up with a sentence, "All the world knows what is Chinese poetry. The only exception is Mrs. Lomová." My husband was teasing me, and he said, "You are the only person in the world." Okay? And it is related to a conception which I would like to introduce to you, and which has a history of about 100 years. Yeah? We will go back to it. So, Chinese poetry, even children in school books, when they have history of literature, world literature, they have one small entry on Chinese poetry, and it presents Chinese poetry in a peculiar way. Yeah? It is supposed to be the true poetry, as I wrote here, yes? Expression of untrammeled individuality, deeper insight into it, provides deeper insight into the laws of the universe. That's what you can read. Czech literary critics, without any studies of sinology, they feel to be entitled to write things like that. Yes? It had a great impact among intellectuals, among artists. You have modern 20th century Czech painters who would be painting inspired by Chinese poetry. Yeah? We will go into detail into it. And on a more general level, actually Chinese poetry, in a special kind of type of Chinese poetry as imagined by Czech people, created a general, very positive image of China. So if you say China or anything Chinese in Czech Republic, people are generally speaking very positive about it. This must be beautiful, this must be something of very high value. Yeah. Then I started to study in the university, and I also was part of this. You know, I read these translations. I read the books about China and Chinese poetry, and that's why I was attracted to go to study Chinese in the university. And then in the university, I learned things about modern China. I learned about Wu Si Yindong, yeah, criticizing the tradition and refusing and trying to get free of the burden of tradition. Yeah. I was reading about the admiration for Western literature, which I thought, well, they admire the things I think that are much less perfect than Chinese poetry. Yeah. Classical Chinese poetry was not expression of free spirit and deeper wisdom about the nature of the universe in the eyes of the Wusu generation. It's literature of the feudal society, which somehow takes away the possibility of freedom from us. Yes? No individuality, no originality, no true metaphor. This is another big issue in this discussion. Yeah? And actually, much later, sometimes in 1990s, several times I met with modern Chinese poets from mainland China. And some of these meetings were quite funny, because they would come to Prague, and I have some friends among Czech poets, and I would bring them together to have a discussion. And the Czech poets would always talk to the Chinese, like Beidao and these poets. They would say, "Oh, I'm so happy to meet you, the representative of the great Chinese tradition." And they started to talk about Li Bai and Tu Fu and Wang Wei. And Beidao was not particularly impressed, because he is a modern poet. He's not the poet of this kind. Yes, so you see this two different words as far as Chinese poetry is concerned. So as I said in the beginning, we can take it. We can take the issue, even though it's a very small issue, of translating Chinese poetry into the language of 10 million people, something very marginal and seemingly unimportant for you. You can take it as a case study in intercultural communication, and you can ask questions: how much is cultural transmission determined by historical and cultural context of the receiving culture? And this I would like to stress. We are not so much interested about the original. We are interested of what happens to the original when it is brought to the receiving culture. Yes. And another question which we'll ask, and I will demonstrate here: is it changing over time? Is it something forever? The Czechs would always have this opinion about Chinese poetry, and I will show no, it's not that simple. Yeah. And then, what are the values of the received culture? What are the true values or true values? We can ask even question whether we can speak about true values. There are many values, and some of them are selected and some of them are not. And of course, again, the same question: how important are the values of the receiving culture? Yeah? And we will see that this is a decisive question. And we can actually, going back to the idea of Wu Si Yindong and a building up of modern Chinese literature, we can again ask a question: isn't it happening the other direction around as well? Isn't, when China is bringing in the Western model, when China is bringing in the Western ideas about literature and Western inspiration in its own literature, isn't something similar happening here? Isn't it again something that, when compared what the West takes for granted, that there may be some differences, misunderstandings, let's say? Okay, so since I don't know how much you know about Czech Republic, about Czech culture, Czech history, let me say a few words. Excuse me if you know it. I will say some very basics. So Czech 捷克, yes, 捷克. you can see we have a complex history. Since 1993, we are a young country. We were the Czech Republic in the border as it is now. It was created in 1993, very, very young. Yeah. Before that, we were Czechoslovakia, Czechoslovakia, shortened as Czech. I was joking that nothing changed for the Chinese because we were always Czech. Yeah. But the official name was Czechoslovakia. Yeah. It was established in 1918 after the First War. Yeah. Before that, we were Bohemia and Moravia within the Habsburg monarchy, yeah, which is the Chinese name Bohemia. I will show you a little bit later a map. This is the name. I think when our name entered China for the first time, I think in the late 17th, early 18th century, it was Bohemia. Yeah, it's a Latin name for the region. But we have an old history. We are proud of our history because there was a medieval kingdom of Bohemia established 1085, and I use this occasion to boast of our university because we have this kingdom established its university more than 600 years ago. So we have our university has a very old tradition. Yeah. Yeah. This is the map, 1674. This is, I'm sorry, I took it from the internet and it's not particularly good. It's a Jesuit map of the world made by Jesuits living in China for the Chinese. You have this Kunituan, yeah, and I can try to do it like this. Bohemia is somewhere here, and if I had a better map, I could zoom in and you would see Bohemia. Yes, the name is there. I saw the map, I saw the original, and I read it, so I promise it is there. Yeah. So, a few words about history. You just saw a history looking back, the stages, how our contemporary nation was, or state was established. Let's wait a little bit, let's stop a little bit talking about our existence under the Habsburg monarchy, because it is related to Chinese poetry, as you will see, yeah? There was the medieval kingdom, quite powerful and important. By the way, the medieval kingdom was important because it was on the crossroad, just in the center of Europe, and there was a commercial center. But once the New World was discovered, the centers moved to the seashore, and we lost our privileged position. Yeah. We became part of the Habsburg monarchy, which eventually resulted in religious and cultural persecution. And part of this religious and cultural persecution, we call it period of darkness. This is, our children learn it in the history, the period of darkness. And part of this persecution was that the language, Czech language, we have our own Slavic language, which is different from German, was marginalized and stopped to be used in education, stopped to be used in literature, became just the language of the poorest, of the most marginalized people. But in the end of the 18th century, something which we call national revival movement started. Yeah? Minzu Fuxing Yundong. I translated this national revival movement. And the national revival movement is analogous to other national revival movements that happened in Europe more or less during the 19th century. One of the latest national revival movements was in Norway. And the Norway national revival movement reached its results only in the beginning of the 20th century. Yeah, because until that time, their language and culture again were marginalized under the Danish kingdom. Yeah, so Another thing I want to mention as a background for the emergence of Chinese poetry in Czech imagination is 18th century European admiration for China. Did you all hear about it? About the 中国风? I checked it on the internet that chinoiserie, this is a French word, is translated into Chinese as 中国风. Did you hear about it? Who did not? Everybody knows what was fashion, okay? So I don't have to go into detail. And this 18th century fashion for China had a very strong impact on Central Europe. I will show you some pictures, I hope. Yes. This is a detail, yes. This is my favorite detail. This is a part of a decoration in one of the Czech castles. And this is China. You know, this is China. You have a mandarin, and you have a musician over there. You have camellia tree over there. Yeah. I have one more picture. This is Feng Huang. This is Feng Huang, yeah. And then you have the huge butterflies, like incredibly huge butterflies. Yeah? This is a huge picture. I just put in details. If we look on these decorations, this was done by a famous French master who was active also in Central Europe as far as north of Poland. Yeah. You see that China is depicted as a country of timeless happiness. People are just smiling there, very happy, very relaxed. Everything is beautiful and fantastic. Yeah, it's like in a beautiful dream. There is a sort of humor in it, but it's positive. It's very, very positive. Well, I have, if you know, I just skip it. These are some of the highlights or important moments in the admiration of China in the 18th century. What is interesting, poetry was not interesting for the Europeans. Yes, these 才子佳人小说 were translated, not great numbers, 2 or 3 of them, but had an impact as wonderful literature, as something. Do you know why 才子佳人小说 were popular in Europe? Have you any idea? Teaching morals, teaching good morals, as stories that teach good morals, good relationships among people. Yeah. And then I mentioned Voltaire's L'Orpheline de la Chine, which is a very free, very inaccurate adaptation of Yuan Zaju, Zhao Shigu'er. Yes, and this is an old Zuozhuan story, etc. Yeah? And again, a story teaching good morals, 道德. I have included a picture to show you the excitement of the. This is a picture from beginning of the 19th century. This is supposed to be Voltaire reading his story about the Chinese orphan, yeah? And you see all the distinguished gentlemen and ladies listening to him and admiring the wisdom of China. Yeah? Maybe if you did not read it, I very much recommend this book by Colin McKerra's Western Images of China. This is an elementary book, very, very easy to understand and very easy to see a broad picture of Western interest in China. And Colin McKerras makes one important point, which actually I will dispute a little bit. He says that there is this idealized picture in the 18th century, which I just summarized a bit. And then it is changed in the 19th century by a very critical picture of China as a sick man in Asia. I'm sure you heard about it sometimes. China depicted in the West as local, as backward, as underdeveloped, as poor, as dirty. Yes, everything is neglected in China. This is what Colin McGrath speaks about, and this is the image which developed in the English-speaking countries. But in Central Europe, in my country, the 18th century idealization remained. There was no change in attitude. Yeah? Again, you can see the diversification of the West on certain points. Okay, so let's go back to the revival of Czech nation. We had a broader context of the European or Western imagination of China. Yeah? The Czech national revival was very much inspired by French Enlightenment, by German Romanticism. It was enabled by government reforms, giving more freedoms to the people. And one of the features of the national revival movement was interest in the people. Yeah? In the people, in the sense, people as representatives of their nations, speaking their national language, having their national character, having their national traditions, customs and traditions. Yeah? The philosophy, the ideological background of the national revival movement in Bohemia was not unique, as I mentioned in the beginning. And there was a big inspiration coming from Germany, or at that time it was not unified Germany. Germany itself went through a national revival movement at that time. And there was this philosopher, Johann Gottfried Herder, who, well, to put it very simple, stressed these following features to be followed and cultivated within each nation. Yes? Language as the first thing. Until this time, the language was not so important. Yeah? Language was not so unique and important. People were speaking the languages which were practical to use and wouldn't be much bothered about something like national language. But Herder formulated an idea that each nation has its own language, which became very important for the Czech national revival movement because they started, I said a few minutes ago, that Czech language became the language of marginalized people and not language of literature, not language of high culture. So within the national movement, and with the support of Herder's idea, Czech intellectuals started to cultivate Czech language. And basically, they were not speakers of Czech language. They were educated in German language within the Habsburg monarchy. And as grown-ups, they started to learn Czech language and started to write in Czech and write about Czech. And I think folklore, folk traditions were very important, were studied, recorded, collected, and the idea of the importance of national folk traditions developed into the idea or interest in different folk traditions. And we will see, including Chinese traditions. Yeah? And then just a small remark, national epos became something very important. Yeah? And we will see, it explains why in the beginning, Chinese poetry, there was interest in Chinese poetry, but it didn't make much impression. Yeah? Okay, so you can see that the national emancipation was conceptualized as seeking equality among great nations of the world. So the equality was something very important. And part of this equality was to confirm that we are as good as the others are. And our language is as good as any other language. Yeah? So, part of it is our language can express anything the other big languages can. And this is a very important moment for translation. Yeah? So, within the National Revival movement, not only the study of language and the creation of new literature in Czech language, in the revived Czech language was important, but translation. And the idea is that we should have translations from all the big nations all around the world, including China, as we will see. Yeah? Well, I repeat myself here a little bit. There are also stress in education. Yeah, there is during a very important moment, cultivating education, and not only educating children in their language, in their native language and local traditions, but also a sort of, we would not call it lifelong education, that even grown-ups should study, should read, should cultivate themselves. And again, one of the most important parts of this education in the 19th century was what we now would call education in humanities, in literature, in philosophy as well, in history. Yeah? Okay, this is the, actually I already mentioned. Yeah, okay. But the first encounter with Chinese poetry was very negative, yes? Yeah? So we can say, that's why I put number 1, within this program of national revival, which wants to bring in literature from all over the world, Chinese poetry failed. I think one of the reasons is the importance of epos at that time. Yes, the beginning 19th century, epos was supposed to be 史诗. Yes, the historical poems, 史诗, epos, was supposed to be the genre, the great genre, and nations that do not have epos are somehow failing. Actually, it is so interesting, I don't know whether you read about it, but during the Wusa period, there was a huge discussion within Chinese literary circles whether China has an epos and what to do about it, that China doesn't have an epos, and that epos did exist and was forgotten or is preserved with the Shaoshuminzu and so on and so on. It's so interesting that this is so similar to the early 19th century. Yeah. So in the early 19th century, there is this is the first book on China. I wrote it in Czech, published in 1810. The first book on China published in Czech. And it brings a very positive picture in the manner of the 18th century idealization. These Voltaire's and other people in the 18th century, this Jesuit picture of positive China, but also this imagination of China as a happy country. Yeah. But if we read about poetry, even education is stressed. Chinese education, Chinese history. I think the author I didn't go into detail, didn't study the sources in detail, but what I could see reading the book on my first reading, he worked with French sources, 18th century French sources. But when it comes to poetry, it's a failure. China, despite all its other perfections, unfortunately lacks any sense of real poetry. We read in the beginning of the 19th century. And then there is, as we know from well-educated connoisseur of Chinese language, the poetry of the Chinese are only short epigrams without any literary values. Yeah? So this is the beginning of the 19th century. Okay. The national revival movement and Herder's ideas inspired interest in the soul of the people, soul of the nations. Yes? Oh, I wanted to show you a picture of in the Czech National Library, but we will forget about it. Yeah? And the key to the soul is poetry. Yeah? This is the romantic idea of the beginning of the first half of the 19th century. And there was this Czech poet. Every Czech person knows this poet. Every Czech child knows this poet, who wrote poetry composed as variations on folk songs. Yeah? He wrote a great number of poems. Some of them the children still have to learn now, Czech children. And they are called, his collection, his most famous collection is called Echoes of Czech Folk Songs. Yeah, as a sort of, to express his inspiration by folk songs in his poetry. He also translated a lot of poetry from Russian and French, and he wrote echoes of Russian poetry and also echoes of other national poetries. And by then he wanted to, introduce the nations and prove the perfection of Czech language. And he also did only two echoes of Chinese poetry. Yeah? If you could read Czech, I would show you the poems. They read the same like you would read the Czech echoes or the Russian echoes. Yeah? These two poems is the first poem in Ching, Tang, yeah, and Mulan Shi. Yeah? These were two poems that he picked in French translation and rewrote them. We can't say it's a word-to-word translation. It's a rewriting in the manner of the echoes of folk poetry. And he wrote a short commentary. It was published in a literary journal for the first time in 1840. And he wrote, I'm giving these two poems to the readers to see into the soul of Chinese nation. Yes, and the people in China, the great nation with that wonderful cultural heritage. Yeah. So, but that's it. What is interesting, I tried to find as many as possible Western translations of Chinese poetry, and there are very few. Until 1850s, until 1850s, 1860s. It seems that the sinologist, even though French sinology starts 1814, I believe, and there were other people and there were translations, poetry was not of particular interest of the sinologists. But in the second half of the 19th century, the interest grows, and we have a third picture of Chinese poetry suddenly rising in late 19th century Bohemia. Yeah? By that time, the national revival movement already achieved all its goals. There was already general education in Czech language for all Czech people. There was well-developed Czech literature, but also science using Czech language. There were journals and all sorts of publications published in Czech, and even there was a government decision that Czech language can be used in official, in the offices, in the government offices. Yeah. By that time, there was a great development in what we call Oriental sciences. We call it in Czech Oriental sciences, sciences about Orient or research about Orient. And there is a very important person whose name is Rudolph Virchow. If you like music, he has the same name as Antonín Dvořák, the Czech musical composer, but they are not related to each other. Yeah? And he did what he did. He did translation of Ching-kuo as a book in 2 volumes actually. You have the dates 1895 and 1912 in 2 volumes. And his translation is very interesting because he translated Ching as a Confucian classic. Yes, if you think about the history of Chinese literature, you have basically 2 opinions on Ching. The traditional Chinese opinion is that it is Jing, it's part of the Confucian tradition, it has some moral teaching, it's related to the realm of Confucian teaching about society. And then you have the modern interpretation that Shiji, anthropological, we could call it anthropological interpretation by scholars like Marcel Granet, the French, and then in China, Benito, for example, that Shiji is actually a reflection of ancient rituals and that the Confucians distorted the meaning, the original meaning of the poems. So Dvořák actually echoed the official Confucian interpretation of Shijing, did the translation, but what he did it as a translation at the same time, as a translation of beautiful poetry. He collaborated, and this is a very marked Czech tradition. He collaborated with a poet. Yes, again, this is a name you most probably do not know, but it was the most famous poet of the time in Bohemia, and they collaborated together. Dvořák provided the language translation, and Vrchlický would polish it into nice poetry. And regular poetry with rhymes, with written. He even experimented to copy the Sian, the 4 syllables, which was not particularly successful. And Czech language is too different from Chinese to be able to do it. Yeah. So this was a very elevated and, let's say, not experimental poetry at all. It was beautiful, it was very accepted, but it was not the progressive. Many things were happening in Czech poetry at that time. There was avant-garde poetry, modernist poetry started to be written. So this was not the case. This was lots of, let's say, a conservative poetry. And then what I started from comes here as a 4th step in the appropriation of Chinese poetry for Czech readers. Yeah? It happened only after the First War. I will talk a little bit about the historical context. And we suddenly, in 1920s, have a new Chinese poetry emerging for Czech readers. Yeah? Poetry as expression of universal humanity, wisdom, and beauty. And something to follow, to get inspiration from. So, again, let's talk about historical context, because the historical context is always very important. It happened after the World War I. Yeah? The war, it was a terrible war, and it created a deep crisis of consciousness. Okay? After the war, the intellectuals, not only in Bohemia, newly created Czechoslovakia, doubted all the values on which the Western civilization was based. By the way, do you know the name Hu Hongming? Hu Hongming, yes? Hu Hongming was very popular. Hu Hongming, the conservative Chinese scholar who was not taken much seriously in China. And actually, I realized recently there are his publications in Chinese. I think there is a new interest in China, in Gu Hongming. His books were not translated into Czech, but they were read in German, and he's frequently quoted by intellectuals. If you read some articles by Czech intellectuals at that time, he is quoted as the one who gives a good advice that we should turn to Confucianism to cure the ills of the society. I don't say that everybody was of this opinion, but very seriously this opinion was expressed. Yeah. So I called it the wisdom, interest in the wisdom coming from the East, yes, to paraphrase some sayings of the period. It is related to such concepts as interest in exotic things, mysticism, beauty. Yes, the exotic things and the East is related to beauty. Pure beauty is coming from there, and it becomes related to literary experiments. Yeah, so as if the Chinese tradition possessed some secret which only the modern artists start to discover. Yeah? Now we go to the most important name, is Bohumil Mathesius. You have his dates here. Was the one who created Chinese poetry for the Czech readers as it lives till contemporary time. Yeah, or it starts to fade away now, but until recently it was the image of Chinese poetry. Yeah, he was a poet himself, not very famous, but he had some ambition to be a poet, and he did publish some small volumes of poetry. He was quite an influential literary critic and journalist. And he was a translator, and I stress the translator. Yeah? He was a cousin of another Mathesius, who was member of the Prague linguistic circle. Yeah? He was from a family where there were other cultural contributions made. So he was translating from French, Russian, and German. His translations from Russian were very famous. And he translated a lot of poetry. And he translated poetry as poetry. He didn't need a poet to collaborate with him. Yeah? He was creating beautiful poetry in his translation. And of course, he also translated some prose. He developed a very specific approach to translation. Not only we will talk in a minute we will talk about translations of Chinese poetry, but in general, when translating poetry, he emphasized the aesthetic dimension of the translation. What does it mean? It's not only selecting beautiful words, it's also imitating the rhythm, the meter of the original. Yeah. And because meter in poetry is always related closely to the language, you cannot mechanically use the same thing. Yeah? So he was developing ways how to transport, let's say, French or Russian meter into the prosody of Czech. Yeah? And what he said and what he stressed, translated poem must be a good poem in the target language. It is the basic requirement. So you don't care about details in the meaning, because part of the meaning is the aesthetic appeal, the poetic impression made on you by the poem, which actually again is something compatible with the thinking of the Prague school about the Prague linguistic circle, about poetry, about language. Okay, so, and what he started to do is, he was translating songs of ancient China. Yeah, this is the name of his collections. There are several names, but this is the best known name. He didn't speak Chinese. He retranslated from French, German, and Russian. And later in his career, he started to collaborate with a sinologist. I will mention it later. Yet, he became, if you read contemporary criticism on his translations, he was regarded to be the one who knows Chinese poetry. Nobody asked him whether he knows the language or not. He is the one who knows it. Yeah? First volume appeared in 1925. And part of his translation effort was translating poems in Lin Yikang's My Country and My People. I suppose you all know the book. I think in Chinese it was 1937, 1930s. So he wrote it, Lin Yikang wrote it in English as part of his effort to present his country mostly to the Americans, to get help to get understanding, sympathy, and help against the Japan aggression. Yeah, and Lin Yikang in his book. Did you read the book? Did you read it? No. It's a wisdom about China, you know. I don't want to be unfair to Lin Yikang. I think he is an interesting and important person in the 20th century. But we could say this is a rather superficial presentation of China, which a little bit goes back to the 18th century idealization. Yeah? I remember what I didn't like in the book. I remember that he speaks about the women's feet, this guojiao, yeah? And he says, after all, a woman is beautiful when walking on these feet, and it's comparable to the high-heeled shoes of the Western women, yeah? Which somehow, I think it's not exactly, even though I know that it's quite a torture sometimes to walk on high-heeled shoes. Yeah. The book very well fits into the poetry. I mean, into the idea of the poetry he was creating in Czech translation. And then he did several volumes. Could I? No. Yeah, I will go back to these two slides in a second. During the war, his translations of Chinese poetry became very, very popular. Yeah. There are 7 editions. I counted 7 different editions of Chinese poetry, and some of them were printed as many times as much as 2 times a year. Yeah, during the war. Virtually everybody was reading it. I remember when I was a small child, visiting my schoolmates at home. Some people had a lot of books at home and some people not. They were not from intellectual families. They would have just a few volumes at home. They would have Chinese poetry translated by Mathesius. Yes. There are moving memoirs of people who survived concentration camps. That the Chinese poems were recited. People remembered them and would be reciting them as a sort of source of consolation and hope for better future, for survival. Yeah. During the Nazi occupation, the Czech government in exile had its own broadcasting, and on the broadcasting they were sometimes quoting these translations. I mean, it had a big social impact. Yeah. As I wrote in the end, Chinese poetry in Mathesius' translation was a source of hope for people during the war. It had a huge, huge impact. You can read it in memoirs of the people writing about the period. What is interesting, I think I didn't put it here, okay, is after 1949, when the People's Republic of China when the communists won in the People's Republic of China, the country was established, the People's Republic of China. We had our own communist takeover in 1948, 1 year before China. One of the reasons, of course, the countries became very close to each other because of the communist regime and the ideology, shared ideology. But one of the reasons why, generally speaking, people embraced admiration for the new China was again the poems, because they imagined that China is what they know from the poems. Yeah, and recently we had an oral history project in which we interviewed people about 1950s and the impression of China, and everybody was talking about the idea of the poems behind what they imagined is happening in China. Now you imagine what was happening in China in 1950s. It had nothing to do with beautiful poetry, but the idea was still alive. Yeah. Okay, so why Chinese poetry? Let's ask why Chinese poetry. There was the second wave of chinoiserie, we could say, in the West. So Mathesius was not totally isolated. Yeah. The idea of wisdom and beauty was around, I already mentioned it. And Chinese poetry, even in other countries, and I think everybody knows Ezra Pound, the creator of Imagism, which had nothing to do with our own imagination, but there are similar approaches. Yeah? There was a belief that in very simplistic translations of Chinese poetry into French and German, and English as well, but English was not, as I said, so important for my country. There is sincere expression of true human experience. You just think about Husserl's Manifesto. One of the things he complains about traditional literature is that it is not sincere, it's not truthful. But there is this sincere expression of true human experience, humanism, poetry of everyday life, direct approach to reality, fresh metaphor, and generally speaking, Tang poetry is a sort of a modernistic poetry. Yeah. Which is opposite to Western empty verbosity. Its language is not distorted by ideologies. The Chinese poetry language is not distorted by ideologies. I already mentioned Ezra Pound. And still, what is important, it reflects the soul of the people. But now the soul is slightly different from the 19th century folk song. Yeah? This we already. Okay. Another question is how the Europeans came around, what they selected, how they started to read Chinese poetry. And I looked, some time ago I was in Paris in some of the libraries that keep old Chinese books, which were brought to France in 19th century. And it's very interesting because apparently the big names of French sinology who started the translation, yeah, they were reading very cheap anthologies. Well, of course, Tang but also other 19th century anthologies of Chinese poetry. Let's say very unscholarly, and they were picking up the poems which they could understand. Yeah. And I suppose everybody has some experience with Tang poetry, and it's not so easy to find a poem that you can directly understand without any deeper knowledge of the literary conventions, allusions, and the context. There are very few poems that are so direct that you just just understand the Chinese characters and know what it is about. So there was a pre-selection by the sinologists who simply took out of the popular collections what was accessible for the first sight. Yeah? Another thing is they may get advice from Chinese readers, which again we know from sources. Yeah? And advice by Chinese readers were, of course, these were educated readers, and they thought, okay, these Westerners, they don't understand much about our culture, so let them start from something simple. Yeah? Another thing is that poems were selected that were close to the sentiments and feelings about life of the European people at certain historical situation. Okay? And later, in case of Czech, of Mathesius, who was retranslated basically from French, German, and Russian, he started, during the war, he started to collaborate with the famous Czech sinologist Jaroslav Průšek. But what is interesting, even though they collaborated, and now he had an advice of a Czech, well-educated sinologist who knew the complexity of the Chinese poetry, yet still, working together, they still produce the same thing. This is so interesting. You can read Průšek's remarks on the poems, saying, in fact, the poem is much more complicated. And there is a lot of cultural knowledge in the background. Yeah? But then he supported the idea of this simplified Chinese poetry for the Czech readers. So what was selected? Mostly Tang, mixed with Taoyuanming, Shijing, and Yuefu. And more or less everything looks the same. Yes, you have an anthology, and you have mixed it all together, and it is all Chinese poetry. Li Bai, Wang Wei, Du Fu, of course, the three names. But there is Zhang Jiuling, Wang Changling, Du Mu, Bai Ju. There is Wang Ji, never any Li Shanyan, never any Li He, for example, yeah, among the bigger names. Yeah. What are the topics? I purposefully put love on the first, as a first topic. It's interesting because if we start reading Chinese poetry, we realize that the love topic is not so dominant. But in the translations, love is very important. Then war, compassion with the suffering of the people. So you can imagine the wartime, drinking wine, and a kind of relaxed Li Bai as a hero of free and of free spirit, nature, the beauty of nature, one way, and accepting death as part of nature, of natural cycle. This is again something stressed again and again, but some Portuguese poems are quoted. Yeah? So actually, I have to admit that when I started to read this Wei-Jin and Wei-Chao period poetry, I was surprised how much death is there, how much desperate feeling over the transient character of life, because I still had in my memory that the Chinese take death very easy. Yeah. Okay, I've summarized the literary styles which are mixed in his translations, in Mathesius' translations, and you have these short poems, vivid imagery, original metaphor. Mathesius even created metaphors which are not in the original. And he admitted in one case, we have recorded his explanation is recorded. He says, well, I felt this is my feeling, it should be there. It is there. It is the Chinese metaphor. Yeah? Okay. His method of translation. I'm speaking too much, so I will go faster. Okay? To summarize, Mathesius expressed an idea that he, without questioning the problem of retranslation from another language, that under the surface, he says, under the surface of a poem, he discovers the true meaning, the poetic proto-language hidden deep in the poem. Yeah? So this is he wrote a preface to one of his translations, and he says that he grasps the poetic proto-language which is hidden behind the words, and that he will do away with the words. That's why he can create his own metaphors. He can shorten the poems. He translated some Tufu's poems, only 1/3 of the poem. Yeah? And he recreates it in modern idiom. He says he brings the proto-language, buried under the words, and he brings it up and he recreates it in modern idiom so that contemporary reader can get into direct relationship with the deep poetic essence in the text. Okay. So just a very brief summary on the form. He of course writes in free verse. If you think about the traditional forms which have very complex and regular meter, no way to imitate it. He cuts the verses. You know what? You have one verse in Chinese and it's cut in 3 or 4 lines. Drawing attention to individual expressions, occasional rhymes, vivid images, original metaphors, again and again, and reprise. There is always surprise, or very often surprise and open ending. There is some surprising moment in the poem. We could call it sophisticated simplicity. This is the conviction that the universal language of poetry is brought to the language, eternal value for all time, easy to read and pleasure to read. Yeah? There are many inaccuracies, even in the poems made together with a sinologist, even mystification. The poet-translator doesn't care about mistakes. And what he says, he is grasping the soul of the ancient Chinese, giving it expression in modern idiom. Not only the poetic essence, but the soul of the Chinese. Yeah, and this, as I mentioned, the style remains the same even after he started to collaborate with a sinologist who must have given him much more information than that eventually ends up in the poem. I think I can, well, let's summarize it, yeah? So, where is the power of Chinese poetry coming from for the Czech readers? It's definitely determined by changing times and wider cultural interests. So where there was not interest in short poetry, there was no need to admire Chinese poetry. It's related to the changing literary interests and values, determined by specific historical situation, changing motivation for translation, and individual contribution. And this I would stress, because there were general trends in Europe, and other languages also have their translations of Chinese poetry, but only very few have this kind of admiration of Chinese poetry as the poetry. Yet, for example, in France, he retranslated very often from French, but in France we didn't have this cult of Chinese poetry. Okay? So, and it is the contribution of the translator who was able to write such poetry that was appealing as poetry to Czech readers who started to believe that they are reading Chinese poetry, but they were actually reading Czech poetry. Yeah? Okay, these are some general conclusions. Yeah? That cultural transmission, successful cultural transmission, means transformation. It is not a simple give and take basis. It's interplay of various factors. Again, I repeat what plays a role. I would call it fruitful misunderstanding. I I wouldn't discuss whether he is correct or not correct. I know as a literary historian and the one who reads Tang poetry that he is not correct, that he is making mistakes. But let's forget about it. This is a fruitful misunderstanding that has an impact. And again, the individual talent. Yeah. And okay, last two questions. Is retransmission of Chinese poetry as conceptualized by the Czech translator possible? Yeah? This is a question, whether via this kind of translation we can make Chinese poetry appealing to the Chinese readers. This is a question, yeah? General readers, I mean. And why I ask this question is the case of Han Shan. Han Shan, the Buddhist personality, eccentric, was not admired in China as a great poet. He was, I still remember when I came for the first time to China, I asked about Han Shan's about the poet Han Shan, and nobody understood me. And they said, "Oh, Sen Ren, a monk, not a poet." But recently, or about 10 years ago, I could see that there is a fashion for Han Shan as a poet. And it comes from the United States, where Han Shan became very, very famous among the 1950s, 1960s poets in translations of Gary Snyder. So this is an example of retranslating of the image of a poet back to this original culture via different, let's say, slightly misunderstanding interpretation back to China. So that's why I asked the question. I don't impose, I don't insist, just I ask the question. So thank you for your attention, and sorry I was talking too much.
Well, certainly, I suppose everyone that here enjoys Professor Lomová's talk, and actually I learned a lot from her. And if allowed, I would like to use our national language, Cantonese, to summarize a bit to the audience, and then we'll entertain a few questions from the audience, right? 我用廣東話稍解釋一下，好嘛？你需要廣東話好定係普通話？廣東話。
Next time I will learn some 廣東話。
其實咧就Professor Lomová 咧，佢有個中文名嘅，就叫做羅然教授，羅然教授。I did mention about the Chinese name of Professor Lomová。佢叫做羅然教授。咁羅然教授咧，其實佢呢一個嘅演講咧，其實我覺得係非常有意思嘅。點去睇咧？我好簡單，因為我係 make a lot of notes。佢所講嗰個過程咧，其實咧俾我哋去反省一下，去諗下。嗱，譬如我哋而家我話用廣東話講好啊，定普通話講咧，嗰個 so-called national language 嗰個語言問題，最近咪有冇睇到孔慶東講唔識講普通話嗰啲就係王八蛋啊？有冇聽過呢個講法？即係我哋位北京大學嘅教授咧就話嗰啲唔識講普通話嘅咧，王八蛋啊！嗰啲點講？即係唔好重複佢太多啦嚇。嗱，咁我哋用廣東話嘅時候咧，其實廣東話等於啲咩嘢咧？其實我哋講阿羅然教授咧，佢講緊佢哋捷克嘅語言。捷克呢一個國家咧，就佢嘅人口咧1000萬左右啊。咁1000萬左右，香港700萬度，唔會差得好遠嚇。好啦，咁呢個700萬1000萬嗰個人口，佢哋用嘅語言喺過去嚟講起咗咩作用咧？嗰個中國文學原來咧係對佢哋呢個國家嗰個民族主義啊嗰個興起咧其實有關聯嘅。咁羅然教授其實咧就佢點去理解中國文學響嗰個捷克成個個文化嗰個建構裏邊咧嗰個作用。咁佢當然咧提到唔係淨係捷克本身，不過從捷克呢個角度去睇嗰個問題。咁呢一點咧其實帶俾我哋好多嘅諗法，就係話我哋點去面對一個語言咧？個語言同文化嘅關係係點咧？咁樣，咁佢咧就提到，譬如話響早期嘅時候咧，就響1770年至1830年嘅時候，捷克有嗰個民族復興運動。民族復興運動咧就係佢哋正式咧去了解翻自己嘅語言咧，究竟有咩作用？ 咁咧就佢哋嘅語言咧就係好美麗嘅，可以將任何世界裏邊人哋嘅其他嘅語言可以做到嘅嘢，佢呢種語言都可以做到嘅。咁用呢個理由咧，於是佢哋要將全世界一個重要嘅佢覺得係好嘅作品咧，翻譯成為捷克文。咁呢個其中就包括咗中國嘅文學。咁因為中國文學咧，響當陣時咧，就響歐洲嘅時候咧，響19世紀以前啊，響呢個18世紀嘅時候咧，就有一個所謂中國風，佢提到中國風個Sinological 呢個中國風咧，其實就係對中國有好多嘅想像。咁個咪羅然教授咪整咗幅圖像出嚟嘅，就係嗰時點樣去睇中國，對中國好多好 fancy 好靚好多嘅神話，啲人都好開心嘅咁樣。咁伏爾泰咧就翻譯咗嗰個趙氏孤兒咁趙氏孤兒咧又點樣去感動當時嘅歐洲嘅嗰啲嘅民眾。咁呢啲等等咧對中國嗰種嘅印象咧，就形成咗中國嘅文化咧響歐洲有好多嘅想像。咁呢一個咧就係一個部分咧，就係捷克用捷克文嚟將佢翻譯咗做佢哋國家嗰個語言咧，就等佢哋可以去了解最好嘅美好嘅世界，一個想像嘅世界咁樣。嗱咁就，但係咧慢慢發展落嚟咧，就呢個民族復興嗰個過程裏邊咧，就去諗下中國嘅詩歌本身咧，就對呢一個捷克嚟講，對捷克佢點去理解佢咧咁樣？其中一個理解嘅態度咧就係話，中國樣樣都好啦，中國嘅詩唔好，因為咧中國冇史詩 ，the epic 史詩，冇史詩嘅話咧，咁呢個民族咧就係爭咗好多嘢。佢嘅詩咧唔係詩嚟嘅，啲詩即係有啲短嘅，咁即係攞嚟根本唔覺得咧有詩嗰個質素喺度。呢個就係其中一個時期中國嘅詩係有呢種咁嘅印象就我哋咧，其實咧呢個問題咧喺中國裏邊五四運動以嚟咧都有嘅。五四運動之後咧，有好多中國人都覺得點解全世界都有史詩，點解中國冇嘅咁樣？或者我哋用漢語寫嘅冇史詩嘅，呢個係咪我哋中國有問題啊咁樣？咁呢個係對當時咧對西方嘅一種嘅仰慕嘅時候，覺得自己反思中國有咩問題嘅一種情況。咁向西方都曾經出現過。咁後來咧就慢慢咧，就會覺得咧，就中國嘅詩咧，就另外嘅角度去體會佢啦。就覺得咧，中國嘅詩咧係反映到中國人嗰個心靈嘅。中國嘅詩咧，就譬如關雎啊，或者嗰啲木蘭辭啊等等啦咁樣咧，佢哋嗰個嘅意義咧，就慢慢咧，又對西方人咧，就或者對捷克人咧，就會有個幫助，有個影響。咁然後開始咧，就有一啲重要嘅漢學家咧，將佢翻譯咗啲詩。咁佢哋翻譯嘅時候好唔準確嘅，翻譯得好唔準確，但係咧。就好感動到當時嘅人。咁呢個咧係19世紀嘅時候一個過程，但係到咗20世紀嘅時候，其中一個好關鍵嘅情況就係第一次世界大戰。第一次世界大戰就叫歐戰啦。對於歐洲個影響咧，大過對中國。對歐洲嘅時候咧，可以話成個對世界觀都改變咗，對好多西方嘅宗教啊、宗教嘅思想咧係失望。於是咧，佢哋去尋求一啲嘅解決，喺邊度揾得到咧？喺中國嗰度揾得到。遠方嘅中國咧，就俾到佢哋好多心靈嘅感受，就覺得咧喺中國裏邊咧去睇到好多嘢。咁呢種情況咧一路發展落嚟咧，直至到第二次世界大戰。剛剛咧就提到咧有另外一位嘅漢學家I don't know how to pronounce it， 馬提修斯係有啲中文咁樣翻譯。Matthias， 咁呢一位咧好重要嘅漢學家咧，將中國嘅詩咧就翻譯成為捷克文，而呢啲中國嘅詩咧，變成好多捷克人咧，去一路咧抵受好多嘅黑暗或者戰爭嘅災難嘅時候，個心靈嘅一個嘅安頓啊！好多人咧俾人拉出去集中營 concentration camp 啊，拉去集中營裏邊咧，佢帶住本中國嘅詩集，讀咗李白嘅詩，讀咗杜甫嘅詩咧，佢安頓咗佢嘅心靈，佢更加覺得咧，原來咧喺啲遠方嗰啲人咧點樣去體會呢個世界，然後咧就幫咗佢去面對當時嘅黑暗嘅日子。你可以想像到咧，中國嘅詩歌咧喺當時喺幾大嘅作用啊！咁咧就呢個部分咧，我哋當然羅然教授咧，因為佢係漢學家，佢就會了解到咧，其實嗰啲翻譯好唔準確嘅，嗰啲翻譯咧唔準，但係咧佢可以用詩嘅方式嚟去將遠方嘅中國嘅詩帶到去俾佢哋嘅世界。咁呢一種咁嘅感受，如果我哋用嚴格嘅翻譯標準，佢係錯，但佢達成好重要嘅一個嘅我哋讀文學作品嘅一個效果。咁呢一點咧就係羅然教授最後尾帶翻落嚟啦，就係話呢一種咁嘅感受，呢一種咁樣嘅得益，會唔會如果由捷克 嗰種嘅理解，第日又傳翻俾中國，會唔會中國又會讀翻同樣嘅詩，會讀多啲嘅嘢咧？於是佢舉例就舉寒山啦嚇 ，Coal Mountain 嚇，咁咧就響呢個美國嘅時候咧，忽然之間好 hit 就個 Beat Generation 裏邊咧就會讀寒山詩，咁呢啲寒山詩嘅中國人唔多讀寒山就得啦嚇，係唐朝個和尚寫嘅詩，唔係好多人睇嘅啫。但係當美國人講過之後咧，慢慢嗰種嘅思潮傳翻嚟中國咧，又好似中國人咧有啲人又開始對寒山詩有興趣啦。嗱呢一點咧，其實咧就係話，如果捷克嗰種理解嘅中國詩，既然咁有效、咁有作用，如果傳翻嚟中國，會唔會又幫到我哋又進一步有多啲唔同嘅理解咧？對中國詩咁樣啊？呢啲咧就係其實咧係對成個課題咧裏邊嘅好多可以帶嚟好多嘅思考。I think I learned a lot, especially about the so-called when we call it the circulation of literature. That's what you may term it as a cultural transmission. And I suppose we will learn a lot, especially we can learn a lot from sinologists like Professor Lomová. So, well, I must say that I learned a lot, as I said, and I would like to hear if there's any question. I suppose Professor Lomová will be happy to answer your questions. 我想你可以用普通話來問。也可以用英文因為羅然教授呢，那個普通話是非常好的好，謝謝。So, any question? 有咩問題啊？
I have actually one remark. I can see a recent development in mainland China, reading or the approach to traditional poetry among scholars. And recently I met a young scholar who is now in Europe. He's a historian. And he also translates poetry into Chinese. He translates 19th century English poetry into Chinese. And he uses Tang poetry meter. He uses Wen Yan Wen and Tang poetry meter, which again brings a new argument, and I simplified it because I put the contrast between the Europe fascinated by traditional China and China itself fascinated by modern West. But now it becomes more complicated because they are already young scholars and translators who try to go back via their own, they don't need the retranslation, via their own way, go back to traditional poetry and use Wen Yan Wen. I was so surprised to translate Western poetry. And he said something which is, I talked a bit about it with him, and he said, we have to give a shape to the poem, we have to give it a beautiful meter. So it's exactly the same Mathesius was telling about his translation, that you have to create something that sounds like a poem, that has an air of a poem, a style of a poem. So this is just one remark to make it more complicated.
有冇咩問題啊？大家可以隨便問我。
太複雜。
Yeah, I just want to ask one question. In translating the Tang poetries from Chinese into your language, would you also introduce the philosophies like the Taoism, Chinese Buddhism? Will you make some introduction or elaboration on that?
You mean if I were translating?
Yeah. For example, Li Ba. I think there is some Taoism in his poems. And Wang Wei, Chinese Buddhism.
Yeah. Actually, I wrote a book about Wang Wei. The translator, as I said, the translator, Mathesius, and other translators following, and there were other minor translators who somehow adapted his approach. They are not bothered about it. They would just generally speak about, the Chinese wisdom, which is there, some Taoism perhaps, very superficial, but they wouldn't explain anything. I myself, I don't translate. because I think there is no way to translate. I either use the, given the very problem of translating a part, I either would have to use the language and style created. Everybody knows how Chinese poems looks like. So I would have to follow in the steps of the translator to do something similar. I cannot do it because I understand that the poems are much more complicated. And I could write an article. I did it several times. I wrote an article explaining the poem or the background, talking about the philosophical background or about the historical background, and talking about how the poet deals with it. But it is not a translation. It's writing about it, even though for general readers. So of course, if you want to explain, if you want to go deeper, you have to explain things like that. But the translators are not bothered by it because they bring up the eternal poetic value, you know. So this is beyond explanation. And of course, there is a lot of misunderstanding or not understanding, but this is not the task the translator sets for himself. He doesn't want to explain. He believes that the poetic value just by itself, irrationally, intuitively, goes into your mind without any explanation. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you.
有冇咩問題啊？是用普通話可以。
時間不早了，大家都要休息。
俾多一個機會你，有冇？好嘢！請講，我幫你俾個咪先嚇。用普通話啊，應該得㗎啦，大聲少少得。
剛剛說就是那些別的愛國人說我們中國就是沒有史詩嘛，那我想就是問為什麼要用史詩來衡量我們中國的詩，然後就是他們對於所謂的史詩的理解是什麼樣？就是
謝謝。這個問題涉及到幾件事。第一呢，因為歐洲的文化的來源跟古希臘有關係，古希臘的文化文學的來源就跟史詩有關係，所以50世紀的知識分子，他們的一個態度就是要證明，有一點跟我們復興運動知識分子類似，要證明我們跟西方一樣好。但這個我們現在用另外一個角度看問題，可是他們當時就是要找到我們，就是我們中國人跟他們西方人有共同的經驗，有能相比的經驗，所以考慮一直都想，那他們呢史詩西方的史詩那麼發達，我們怎麼會沒有？我們跟西方一樣好，我們應該有的。現在我們看問題有一點不一樣，我們會說，那人家有史詩，我們有詩經詩，都一樣好。可是當時的思想就是走另外一條道路，所以一直都討論史詩，到底在哪裡？那有兩個解釋，你們大概知道，一個是就是那個儒家思想。對原來的很好的，包括有史詩在內的傳統，就是有不好的影響。另一方面就是說，史詩其實在什麼就是接在一起的，就是少數民族叫他們有史詩，其實跟中國古老的史詩可能有關係。我個人呢，不需要史詩，因為是20世紀的人，所以不需要史詩。對，我回答了你的問題嗎？可能我沒有全部的回答了吧？
像差不多了。
差不多了，好，谢谢，谢谢。
So, do you have any other questions? So, if not, then I suppose we have a very good time, and I suppose everyone's enjoyed Professor Lomová's talk. So let us give her a quick hand.